E23, armored in gold.
Spoilers all books!
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Radio Westeros. I'm Lady Guinevere in Boston.
And I'm Yolkboy in England. And today we're going to begin our two-part look at Peter Baelish. That's right, for the first time ever, we've decided to split an episode into two parts after we began writing it.
Yeah, we just had too much to say about Littlefinger, so we decided to go with one episode on his political and economic manipulation of Westeros, specific to King's Landing, which is what we'll be looking at today, followed by a second episode that will be a close look at his relationships with Cat, Lysa, and Sansa, the politics of the Vale, and our evaluation of his endgame and predictions for his fate.
And so we've come a really long way since our very first 45-minute episode on Arya and Mercy to our more recent 2.5-hour bumper special on Prophecy. But upwards of 3 hours on Littlefinger seems like a bit too much to squeeze into one episode. So today we'll start with an overview of the character, followed by an examination of his rise to power and some Baelish economics, and conclude with a lengthy analysis of his plotting and his network of spies and agents.
Yeah, we really think we're going to be able to give you a more full analysis all around by offering this special double feature, and we hope you all enjoy it. Before we get started, we want to shout out all our listeners who weighed in on Twitter on this subject. We got a lot of very useful, not to mention very kind, feedback that helped us make this decision. So thanks, guys. And any of you listeners who haven't connected with us on social media, come on by our website or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Tumblr. We're also on YouTube, as many of you will know, and we try to stay active on fan forums, too. So anywhere you want to send us your feedback, questions, messages, we'd really love to hear from you, and we always try to respond.
And just a heads up that we'll have a few light spoilers for the Elaine Winds of Winter chapter today. Nothing major though, since we're going to look at that more closely next time. So now let's get started with Peter Baelish. And as I mentioned, we're going to start out with a brief overview of his character just to take in the basic facts before we really start to dig into the details.
Okay, so Littlefinger is first mentioned on page when Bran overhears Jaime talking to Cersei in that tower room at Winterfell just before his fateful fall. Cersei's bemoaning Robert's choice of Eddard Stark to be Hand, and here's Jaime's reply. We ought to count ourselves fortunate. The king might as easily have named one of his brothers, or even Littlefinger, God's help us. Give me honorable enemies rather than ambitious ones, and I'll sleep more easily by night.
So Littlefinger is placed in opposition to Ned right from the start here and termed ambitious by Jaime Lannister. This turns out to be singularly accurate, and his grouping with the king's brothers is very interesting in light of some of the things we'll discuss shortly. But it's not until much later in A Game of Thrones that we learn more about him, and the fact that he's well known to Catelyn Stark.
Right, it's in a Catelyn point of view as she approaches King's Landing with Sir Rodrik Cassel in what is supposed to be a covert visit to her husband. Rodrik warns her that she must not be seen because there are those in King's Landing who will know her by sight. Her response is a memory that fills in some critical background information. Catelyn's mouth grew tight. Littlefinger, she murmured. His face swam up before her, a boy's face, though he was a boy no longer. His father had died several years before, so he was Lord Baelish now, yet still they called him Littlefinger. Her brother Edmure had given him that name long ago at River Run. His family's modest holdings were on the smallest of the fingers, and Peter had been slight and short for his age.
So now we know who Littlefinger is, how he got his nickname, and that he goes way back with the Tully family. We later learn he was fostered at Riverrun by Lord Hoster, and the question of how that came to be was answered by George at a signing in 2005, where he told fans that Peter's father and Hoster Tully had met during the War of the Ninepenny Kings and become friends. The elder Baelish later used that friendship to get his son fostered at Riverrun.
Yeah, but given what we later learn about the Baelish family history, the question of how Peter's father came to be a lord remains yet unanswered. When we get a glimpse of the Baelish family home in the Fingers in A Feast for Crows through Sansa's eyes, she sees a shield with an unfamiliar sigil, and Peter's explanation for it fills in some more details about House Baelish. Here's the passage. The device painted on the shield was one Sansa did not know, a grey stone head with fiery eyes upon a light green field. My grandfather's shield, Peter explained when he saw her gazing at it. His own father was born in Bravos and came to the Vale as a sellsword in the hire of Lord Corbray, so my grandfather took the head of the Titan as his sigil when he was knighted.
Right, so Peter's great-grandfather was a sellsword brought to the Vale from Bravos by Lord Corbray. His son, Peter's grandfather, was knighted, presumably by one of the Corbrays and possibly during one of the Blackfire rebellions. In light of this information, one of the first things we wonder about Littlefinger upon learning his family history is how on earth did they rise to being petty lords in the next generation? And we wonder if the answer could be with a marriage.
Yeah, and this is pure speculation, but since the Corbrays were the original patrons of House Baelish and were historically known as the Kings of the Five Fingers, it seems reasonable that the first Lord Baelish might have received his lands and keep on the Fingers from his family's patrons, the Corbrays. While it's possible that this could have simply been a reward for some kind of service, we can't help but wonder if such a rapid rise was perhaps accompanied by a marriage alliance with the Corbray family.
But such a connection is obviously in the realm of speculation, and anyway is hardly necessary to understanding Peter Baelish. As Jaime Lannister noted, Littlefinger is ambitious, which could be his defining characteristic. Tyrion later acknowledges that Baelish is a master juggler with, quote, a gift for rubbing two golden dragons together to breed a third. His meteoric rise from minor lord with an insignificant post in the Vale to master of coin for the realm is often attributed to his extraordinary skill at growing money during the reign of a king with prodigious appetites for luxuries and tournaments.
Yeah, and George's comments about Littlefinger on a program about Machiavellian characters in A Song of Ice and Fire really highlight that factor in his rise. George said Baelish is probably the most Machiavellian character in the books. Here's a quote. Everybody trusts him because he seems powerless and he's very friendly and he's very helpful. He's always ready to help to raise money, so he's everybody's friend. But of course there's the Machiavellian thing. He ingratiates himself with people and rises higher and higher as a result.
Right, and those sentiments are echoed in Clash by Tyrion. Littlefinger was no threat to anyone. A clever, smiling, genial man, everyone's friend, always able to find whatever gold the king or his hand required, and yet of such undistinguished birth, one step up from a hedge knight, he was not a man to fear. He had no banners to call, no army of retainers, no great stronghold, no holdings to speak of, no prospects of a great marriage.
So, Peter Baelish is revealed to be an ambitious man, seemingly no threat to anyone, eager to please, always genial and helpful. He might be said to embody a quality that Machiavelli found very important, the appearance of virtue. Yet behind those grey-green eyes and the sly smile that doesn't quite reach them, we get the sense early on that there's more going on than meets the eye. And in time, we learn that Littlefinger is a schemer and manipulator who would have made Machiavelli proud, willing to act in conflict with ideals of virtue, and always ready to adapt to new situations and act in his own best interest.
And so we're going to look at how Littlefinger rose to power, how he used finance to cement this power, as well as the impact the power of suggestion and a well-placed network of agents has had on his position. And of course, he's not opposed to some good old-fashioned negotiation and statecraft, the rewards of which can be much more tangible than those from his more shadowy pursuits, as this reading demonstrates. So here's Peter Baelish receiving his reward from the crown following the Battle of the Blackwater.
When the herald called,
Lord Peter Baelish,
he came forth dressed all in shades of rose and plum, his cloak patterned with mockingbirds. She could see him smiling as he knelt before the Iron Throne. He looked so pleased. Sansa had not heard of Littlefinger doing anything especially heroic during the battle, but it seemed he was to be rewarded all the same. Sir Kevin got back to his feet.
It is the wish of the King's grace that his loyal counsellor Peter Baelish be rewarded for faithful service to crown and realm. Be it known that Lord Baelish is granted the castle of Harrenhal with all its attendant lands and incomes, there to make his seat and rule henceforth as Lord Paramount of the Trident. Peter Baelish and his sons and grandsons shall hold and enjoy these honours until the end of time, and all the lords of the Trident shall do him homage as their rightful liege. The King's hand and the small council consent.
On his knees, Littlefinger raised his eyes to King Joffrey.
I thank you humbly, your grace. I suppose this means I'll need to see about getting some sons and grandsons. So I hope you enjoyed that reading. And even though Sansa doesn't recall him doing anything especially heroic during the battle, Littlefinger was very handsomely rewarded there. And now we're going to examine his rise from son of an insignificant minor noble from the back of beyond to master of coin for the realm, Lord of Harrenhal, as we just heard, and ultimately Lord Protector of the Vale. Moments before her death, Lysa Arryn remarked, "It was me who got you your first post, who made Jon bring you to court so we could be close to one another." And she also mentioned telling her father about Baelish. He'll rise high.
Well, long before Lysa had her say, we heard about Baelish's rise to power and some of his methods from Tyrion, who had conducted an investigation of sorts into the man following his return to the city in A Clash of Kings. And he learned that, quote, 10 years ago, Jon Arryn had given him a minor sinecure in customs, where Lord Peter had soon distinguished himself by bringing in 3 times as much as any of the king's other collectors. King Robert had been a prodigious spender. A man like Peter Baelish, who had a gift for rubbing 2 golden dragons together to breed a third, was invaluable to his hand. Littlefinger's rise had been arrow-swift. Within 3 years of his coming to court, he was master of coin and a member of the small council, and today the crown's revenues were 10 times what they had been under his beleaguered predecessor.
Of course, Tyrion goes on to qualify that the crown's debts had grown as well. This is something that Littlefinger himself clarified early in game at Ned's first council meeting. The crown is more than 6 million gold pieces in debt, Lord Stark. The Lannisters are the biggest part of it, but we have also borrowed from Lord Tyrell, the Iron Bank of Braavos, and several Tyroshi trading cartels. Of late, I've had to turn to the faith. The High Septon haggles worse than a Dornish fishmonger.
We mentioned in our Tywin episode how Tywin had begun the process of assuming the crown's debts during the reign of Aerys II. And while Ned's reaction to that last piece of news was one of disbelief, quote, Aerys Targaryen left a treasury flowing with gold. How could you let this happen? We actually suspect the crown's treasury may have been encumbered of debt to House Lannister, at least, at the outset of Robert's reign. But regardless, it's quite clear that Littlefinger vastly expanded the debt, including returning once again to the Iron Bank, whose dispute with Aerys over debt assumed by his father Jaehaerys is what led to Tywin getting involved in the first place.
Yeah, and we also get our first glimpse of Littlefinger's method in Tyrion's POV, when he thinks, A master juggler was Peter Baelish. Oh, he was clever. He did not simply collect the gold and lock it in a treasure vault. No, he paid the king's debts in promises and put the king's gold to work. He bought wagons, shops, ships, houses. He bought grain when it was plentiful and sold bread when it was scarce. He bought wool from the north and linen from the south and lace from Lys, stored it, moved it, dyed it, sold it. The golden dragons bred and multiplied, and Littlefinger lent them out and brought them home with hatchlings. And in the process, he moved his own men into place. The keepers of the keys were his, all four. The king's counter and the king's scales were men he'd named. The officers in charge of all three mints, harbour masters, tax farmers, customs sergeants, wool factors, toll collectors, pursers, wine factors, 9 of every 10 belonged to Littlefinger. They were men of middling birth, by and large, merchants' sons, lesser lordlings, sometimes even foreigners. But judging from their results, far more able than their higher-born predecessors.
Okay, so a few things really stand out there. First, the practice of paying the king's debts in promises rather than actual coin sounds like a risky practice called deferred interest that could lead to principal debt ballooning out of control. At the same time, there's an appearance of financial health because those gold dragons were breeding and multiplying, bringing home their hatchlings. There's a certain brilliance to investing in raw materials and in the industries that produced finished goods from those materials that speaks of a deep understanding of the market. But in the process of using borrowed money to make more money, Littlefinger was apparently also making loans of his own. With income from loans and capital investments, Littlefinger created an illusion of prosperity prior to the War of the Five Kings, which might have been described in modern terms as a bubble based upon his manipulation of the market had a wartime economy not taken over.
And we shouldn't ignore the possibility that Baelish actually laid at least some of his plans to take advantage of a wartime economy. Nor should we ignore the possibility that the author hasn't actually intricately mapped out the economics of Westeros and has merely given us a rough framework to analyse, against which we're making a lot of inferences. At any rate, since it's clear that Baelish's initial rise was directly related to multiplying incomes in his first customs posting at Gulltown, we can safely infer that he achieved growth, at least at first, by increasing tax revenues. And while we could debate whether high taxes lead to economic contraction or expansion, one thing is clear about taxes. Tomorrow's tax income would remain the principal source of income for paying off today's debts, and so that income must be sustained or increased to meet the demands.
Also, in general, it must be acknowledged that when governments spend and borrow, they must do so carefully in order to avoid negatively impacting the availability of resources for the private sector. Failure to do so, even in a medieval setting, could be devastating. We see this in action in the story in the form of grain and bread. Tyrion notes in A Storm of Swords that Littlefinger bought grain when it was plentiful and sold bread when it was scarce, a practice which is alluded to again in the Sansa Winds of Winter preview chapter that was released earlier this year.
Yeah, and we think that given his position in the treasury with purse strings in hand, customs, tax, and tariff collectors in his pocket, and his connections with merchants in places like Braavos, Lys, and Tyrosh, Baelish is uniquely suited to engage in price-fixing schemes. Consider the impact if grain bought at low prices when it was plentiful is secretly harboured abroad and then imported at a profit when it's scarce. Besides the profit from the sale of the grain, there would be added income streams for the crown in the form of import tariffs, mill taxes, which were typical of medieval economies, and considering what we'll see about Baelish's relationship with the merchants of King's Landing, possible kickbacks from the now inflated value of bread made from the grain.
And we do think it's highly likely that we've seen the result of some of this scheming in the bread riots that took place in King's Landing 2 months prior to the Battle of Blackwater, and in the plot of the Antlermen, in which a group of merchants and tradesmen planned to open the city gates to Stannis. The scarcity and high prices of bread in the city had been remarked upon numerous times after Tyrion arrived in the city. In fact, in the same chapter where Tyrion noted that Littlefinger bought up grain at low prices to sell as bread when demand was high, he received a delegation of tradesmen, bakers, butchers, and greengrocers who had previously petitioned the crown for food, who were now seeking protection. On this occasion, Bronn told Tyrion, "They want protection. Last night, a baker was roasted in his own oven. The mob claimed he charged too much for bread."
So an interesting tidbit here is that this group had previously appeared seeking bread. In light of the depths of Littlefinger's scheming and connections with merchants, we wonder if this wasn't some attempt on their part to force his hand and get some of that grain that he might have been sitting on released to them. As the situation grew more dire in the city and merchants fell afoul of the hungry mob, imagine what these men might do if they knew there was grain to be had if only the crown would act. Might they decide to transfer their allegiance to another contender? Could this be a plausible motivation for the Antlermen? At any rate, on this occasion, as on the other, Tyrion sent them away with their pleas unanswered.
Yeah, and Tyrion's inability or failure to feed the people of King's Landing would lead directly to the bread riots a few months later. But in this chapter, he returns to his chambers and finds Peter Baelish waiting for him. After an exchange between Littlefinger and Podrick Payne about rabbits and the pots in which they could be cooked, which proves not only that Baelish is aware of the dire circumstances of the city's food supplies, but gives another strong hint at the nature of his creative economics, he has a meeting with Tyrion, in the course of which we get Tyrion's thoughts about Littlefinger's background and methods that we've been discussing. What's interesting is that Tyrion at no point seems to connect the bread shortage with his visitor, whom he is admittedly aware is at least dabbling in price fixing. But it seems that he's more focused right here on laying his trap to uncover Cersei's informant, and it isn't until much later, in hindsight, that Tyrion considers the impact that Littlefinger's machinations may have had upon the city.
And before we move on with Tyrion's discoveries and thoughts about Littlefinger, it's worth noting that the cabal which ultimately saved King's Landing from famine was recruited and led to the city by none other than Peter Baelish. Given that we learned early in game that Lord Tyrell was one of the Crown's larger creditors, we have to wonder if there's possibly a connection between Baelish and Tyrell that surpasses the Joffrey and Margaery plotting. But we'll be looking more closely at that in our next segment, so for now let's get back to Tyrion and the case of the Antlermen. Recall in the passage we started with that Tyrion reflected how, in the process, Littlefinger moved his own men into place. And then Tyrion went on to list the offices held by men who were Littlefinger's appointees. As Tyrion thinks, no one had ever thought to question the appointments, and why should they?
But as the details of the plot of the Antlermen unfolds, it becomes clear that these so-called Antlermen were some of those very appointees, and that their offices had been purchased rather than awarded. When Varys first brings news that a group of men were plotting to open the gates for Stannis, Tyrion thinks, I know some of those names. These are rich men, traders, merchants, craftsmen. It's only later in A Storm of Swords and in retrospect that Tyrion, now master of coin himself and trying to find his way through the pages of Littlefinger's account books, thinks, Peter Baelish had not believed in letting gold sit about and grow dusty, that was for certain. But the more Tyrion tried to make sense of his accounts, the more his head hurt. It was all very well to talk of breeding dragons instead of locking them up in the treasury, but some of these ventures smelled worse than week old fish. I wouldn't have been so quick to let Joffrey fling the antlermen over the walls if I'd known how many of the bloody bastards had taken loans from the crown.
Okay, so given the implications of price fixing and market manipulation, these loans to the very tradesmen who would have benefited on some level from these plots seem suspect at best. But further details come from Jaime in the aftermath of Tyrion's escape, as he searches the dungeons for clues. Here's a quote. The last chief jailer had been a cloth merchant who purchased the office from Littlefinger during Robert's reign. No doubt he'd had good profit from it for a few years, until he made the error of conspiring with some other rich fools to give the Iron Throne to Stannis. They called themselves Antlermen. So Joffrey had nailed antlers to their heads before flinging them over the city walls.
And it's really wheels within wheels here, as it seems that in addition to taking loans and not repaying them, manipulating markets, and making loans to tradesmen, Peter Baelish had a nice side business of selling offices to the very tradesmen who were taking the loans from the crown. In other words, we find that we're dealing with graft rather than simple political cronyism. And since it's entirely possible that those offices were paid for with the funds borrowed from the treasury, besides corruption and misappropriation of funds, we think there's also a plausible case to be made for money laundering. Especially if we assume that those funds were then directed into one of Baelish's many private enterprises, which include both trading ships and whorehouses, given his remark to Ned in Game of Thrones, quote, brothels are a much sounder investment than ships, I've found. Whores seldom sink, and when they're boarded by pirates, why, the pirates pay good coin like everyone else.
Yes, so Littlefinger's sense of humour aside, it seems that at the very least we have a complex series of transactions designed to confuse the casual observer, which upon inspection smell worse than week-old fish. But in spite of the obvious shadiness, and perhaps because of the complex nature of his dealings, Tyrion wondered even before he became familiar with the accounts. Do I dare touch him, even if he is a traitor? The complexity of replacing all of Littlefinger's men and tracing his affairs through this maze of all his ledgers might have taken Tyrion a lifetime to accomplish, even without a war raging in the background. As it is, Tyrion concludes early on that, if ever truly a man had armoured himself in gold, it was Peter Baelish.
So, Baelish, every man's friend, who is a threat to no one, has taken the extra precaution of weaving such a tangled web of finance that he's made himself indispensable, truly armoring himself in gold. And the truth of this is borne out in A Feast for Crows, when the small council in King's Landing discusses a letter from the Lord's Declarant regarding Lord Baelish and the disposition of the Vale. Cersei has grown weary of Giles Rosby as Master of Coin and thinks she sees a way to solve two problems at once. If truth be told, Littlefinger had been more use at court. He had a gift for finding gold and never coughed. Lord Orton has convinced me. Maester Pycelle instruct these Lords Declarant that no harm must come to Peter. Elsewise, the crown is content with whatever dispositions they might make for the governance of the Vale during Robert Arryn's minority.
And while on the one hand it seems like Cersei is withdrawing the crown's support for Littlefinger, she believes that she has effectively guaranteed his safety and eventual return to King's Landing, where he could take up finding her gold again. Of course, typically Cersei remains utterly unaware of Baelish's true purpose, his involvement in her son's death, and the fact that she herself has been a pawn in his game, which no doubt was Littlefinger's exact intent when he set about creating this armour of finance for himself.
Okay, so even if the crown refrains from overt support of Baelish as the Lord Protector of the Vale, they are strongly motivated to ensure his safety because of his gift for finding gold, which leaves Littlefinger free to pursue his interest in the Vale. As we'll be discussing in our next episode, he uses a similar combination of financial and political manipulation there, although we think his intentions in the Vale ultimately have a much more personal dimension. And speaking of Littlefinger's intentions, in our next segment, we'll be looking at Littlefinger's political game, from spies and secret alliances to his arcane objectives and web of plots. Who really works for Petyr Baelish, and how far back his plans go is tough to untangle. As Varys told Illyrio in A Game of Thrones, the gods only know what game Littlefinger is playing. So, up next, we're going to do our best to interpret when the chaos he sows is for its own sake, and when it's providing cover for a deeper and more sustained endgame.
Always keep your foes confused. If they are never certain who you are or what you want, they cannot know what you are like to do next. Sometimes the best way to baffle them is to make moves that have no purpose or even seem to work against you.
So, in our last segment, we considered Littlefinger's rise to power and how he became a market manipulator and the ultimate shady financier. Now in this segment, we're going to really dig into a subject matter that so many of our listeners are interested in, Petyr Baelish and the Game of Thrones. We'll consider how far back his plotting goes and how often is the chaos he works to create an end in itself or a cover for a deeper objective.
Yeah, a lot of people have pointed out Littlefinger's penchant for creating chaos. He's even commonly compared to trickster characters like Loki of Norse mythology. And one interesting connection we could make between Littlefinger and Loki is that both are connected with giants. Loki's father is a Jotun, or giant, and he's often associated with giants in legend. House Baelish, as we mentioned earlier, originated in Braavos, and Petyr's grandfather took the head of the Titan, who's referred to as a giant, as his sigil. In our next episode, we'll go into more depth about Baelish's association with giants, but for now we'll leave it as a curious little connection with the trickster figure Loki.
Okay, so trickster figures in legend and mythology are typically those who break or bend social or moral rules by using trickery, deceit, or occasionally thievery. The trickster may have a goal, such as obtaining food or making the gods look foolish, but he often operates from a mischievous desire to simply sow chaos. And we would agree that Littlefinger does have a lot in common with trickster characters. But as we heard in the quote we opened with, the chaos he causes often has a purpose. Here's the full passage. Why should I wish Joffrey dead? I had no motive. Besides, I'm 1,000 leagues away in the Vale. Always keep your foes confused. If they're never certain who you are or what you want, they cannot know what you're like to do next. Sometimes the best way to baffle them is to make moves that have no purpose or even seem to work against you. Remember that, Sansa, when you come to play the game.
So we see there Petyr telling Sansa that he had no motive for plotting the death of Joffrey Baratheon, that any involvement on his part was aimed at keeping his enemies guessing. But to what extent is he actually confessing anything to Sansa? How much of this is grandstanding, and how much of this is real insight into his methods? Just how trustworthy are any of the words that come out of Peter Baelish's mouth? These are things that we're going to consider.
And because this is such a complex analysis, we thought we'd give a little heads up about our methods here, because as a non-point of view character, it's very difficult to trace Littlefinger's machinations throughout the plot. In order to analyze them, we're basically going to go left to right, starting with events in Game of Thrones and ultimately going right up through the Elaine Winds of Winter sample chapter in our next episode. However, in the course of that analysis, we'll be jumping back and forth a lot because often, as we're sure our listeners are aware, George reveals things slowly over the course of several books and from multiple point of views. For example, when we're talking about things that happened in Game of Thrones, we're going to be using quotes from Storm and Feast to support our conclusions. So, just so there's no confusion about what appears to be jumping all over the place, we do have more or less linear analysis planned here.
Okay then, so let's dig right into something that happens right near the beginning of A Game of Thrones, in Catelyn's second POV chapter. Cat and Ned are in their bedchamber and Maester Luwin arrives, having discovered a carved wooden box in his study that held a mirrorish lens and, secreted under a false bottom, a message addressed to Catelyn. It turns out to be from her sister, Lysa Arryn, and is written in a secret language only Cat can understand. Now at this point, we've heard very little about Lysa Arryn, and Peter Baelish hasn't even been mentioned. We have no reason to doubt the things Lysa would be telling her sister, and it turns out the contents of the message are extremely serious and inflammatory.
Yeah, it's an accusation that the Lannisters were responsible for the death of Jon Arryn, Lysa's husband and Ned's foster father, which was mentioned in Cat's previous chapter. This accusation is bound to create tension between Starks and Lannisters, but it's also the factor that convinced Ned that he must accept Robert's offer and go to King's Landing as his hand. And now fast forward to A Storm of Swords, we learn from Lysa Arryn that the message was sent on the instructions of Peter Baelish. Here's the quote. "I wrote to Catelyn and told her the Lannisters had killed my lord husband, just as you said. That was so clever."
In that same passage in Storm, we also learn that it was Lysa Arryn who killed her own husband, also at the behest of Littlefinger. Baelish manipulated Lysa into believing that they were killing Jon Arryn so that the two of them could be together, and to prevent her son being sent to Dragonstone for fostering, as this quote indicates. "You told me to put the tears in Jon's wine, and I did. For Robert, and for us."
But what was Littlefinger's real goal here in killing the Hand of the King? While we could make a case that his goal was to sow discord between Starks and Lannisters to benefit his own endgame, and that perhaps he did wish to free Lysa from her marriage, not for romantic reasons, but so that he could seize control of the Vale, we think there might have been something else at stake, something more in the self-preservation realm. Perhaps Jon Arryn had become aware of some of Littlefinger's more questionable business deals. Remember this exchange between Ned and Varys in A Game of Thrones. Why? Why now? Jon Arryn had been Hand for 14 years. What was he doing that they had to kill him? "Asking questions," Varys said, slipping out the door.
So while most of us understand that to be a reference to Jon Arryn investigating Robert's bastards, in light of what we learned from Lysa in Storm, that it was not the Lannisters who poisoned Jon Arryn, it's interesting to consider what questions were being asked and who they were a threat to. Let's clarify that there's absolutely no doubt that Jon Arryn was actively looking into the bastards of King Robert, and that once he fell ill, his death was seen as a fortuitous circumstance by the Queen. Pycelle admitted as much to Tyrion in Clash. But since Jon Arryn was Peter's patron, had observed him in action for many years, and was definitely not a fool, we think perhaps it's possible that there was a reason why Jon Arryn had to die at that time, and that it could be revealed at some point in the future that Jon Arryn's questions threatened Peter Baelish in some way.
Ultimately, other than the fact that Varys himself would later implicate Baelish to Tyrion, there's no direct proof at this time. But we should point out that the various options for Littlefinger's motivations in killing Jon Arryn are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it's completely in keeping with what we know of Littlefinger's methods to suppose that he may have had multiple reasons for his actions. Now, getting back to that wooden box at Winterfell, we want to leave that subject with the observation that, in order for the box to have been delivered to Maester Luwin at the right time and place, Littlefinger must have had an agent at Winterfell during the royal visit. Fans have wondered about individuals from Lothar Brune to the Catspaw who later attacked Bran. We don't really think the identity of the person is as important as the fact of his presence. Brune or some other faceless freerider seem likely, but the simple fact that Littlefinger was able to place one of his nameless friends in the heart of the North indicates the reach of the man, something we'll look at more in our next segment, as well as the long game he's playing.
Okay, so let's move on now to King's Landing. In our next episode, we'll cover Baelish's first encounter with Ned and the meeting with Cat. We want to focus here on the ways in which Littlefinger, with his bait taken and Ned embroiled in the viper's nest of King's Landing politics, then manipulated the outcome of the crisis between the Starks and Lannisters to his own ends. It's pretty widely agreed that Littlefinger spoke the words in Joffrey's ear that led to the order to execute Lord Stark. But what insight can we gain into his larger endgame by examining his actions during the time leading up to that moment? We think the answer is a lot.
So we're going to sum up what was going on in the capital after Ned's arrival. Already extremely suspicious of the Lannisters because of Lysa's message, Ned's dislike and mistrust of them was heightened by the friction on the King's Road. This was compounded by Robert's paranoia over Daenerys Targaryen's pregnancy, which culminated in a small council meeting where the two quarreled and Ned resigned his post as Hand. In the meantime, Ned had received the news of the attempt on Bran's life from Cat, which only exacerbated his deep suspicion of the Lannisters.
And that trail, like the one from Lysa's claims about her husband's death, leads directly back to Littlefinger, who first pointed the finger of ownership of the cat's paw's dagger at Tyrion Lannister, which led to Cat's abduction of Tyrion on the King's Road and ultimately the outbreak of open hostility between Stark and Lannister. And it was Littlefinger who led Ned to those servants of Jon Arryn's who revealed critical pieces of information to Jory Cassell, that their lord had been quarrelling with the king, that he was sending his boy to be fostered on Dragonstone, that he had visited a master armourer to commission a new suit of plate, and that the king's own brother, Stannis, had gone with him to help choose the design. And most remarkably, they, that is Arryn and Stannis, visited a brothel.
So, we don't know exactly why the king and his hand were quarreling, although we can guess that it was over the fostering of young Robert Arryn, something which is mentioned often enough that it must be significant. But the other tidbits ultimately led Ned to Gendry and Little Barra. And in the end, Littlefinger himself brought Ned to Barra, and, suspiciously enough, it was that very evening that Jaime Lannister ambushed Ned and his men in the streets of King's Landing in retaliation for Cat's kidnapping of Tyrion. Could Littlefinger have tipped him off? We think there's a very strong likelihood of that.
It was also due to Littlefinger's hints that Ned discovered that Jon Arryn was conducting his investigation along with the king's brother. As Stannis told Cat in Clash, it was he who had first brought his own suspicions to the Hand. But as our friend Bryndon Beefish of Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire blog has written, there's a strong likelihood that it was Peter Baelish himself who initiated that line of investigation by dropping a word into Stannis' ear. We have this exchange between Varys and Tyrion to support that. Stannis accuses my brother and sister of incest. I wonder how he came by that suspicion. Perhaps he read a book and looked at the colour of the bastard's hair, as Ned Stark did, and Jon Arryn before him. Or perhaps someone whispered it in his ear. If you were not this whisperer, who was? Some traitor, doubtless. Littlefinger? I named no name.
Now, since all these roads seem to lead back to Littlefinger, it's very hard not to conclude that he was actively working to set Baratheon, Stark, Arryn, and Lannister at odds. That he saw the value of drawing House Tyrell into the fray quite early on is hinted at in A Game of Thrones when he queries Sansa on why she would have sent Loras Tyrell to hunt down Gregor Clegane. Sansa's answer about heroes and monsters revealed much about her own personality, but Littlefinger's reply, "Those are not the reason I'd have given, but," offers a hint that Baelish would have sacrificed Sir Loras to Sir Gregor in order to place the Tyrells in opposition to the Lannisters.
Yeah, he obviously thrives off chaos and sees potential to advance himself in both power and wealth through creating it. But like a good chess player, whose moves may sometimes seem unfathomable, we do think he has a specific ultimate endgame in mind, which will be the subject of our next episode. For now, let's consider where the king's other brother, Renly Baratheon, fits into this. Renly's role in the ramp-up to the War of the Five Kings is easy to overlook, but given the importance of its erstwhile allies the Tyrells to the plot going forward, we think it was a critical one, and that Peter Baelish was deeply involved with the Tyrells much earlier than we are led to believe.
Yeah, we do. And the first hint we have that Renly is involved in plotting with the Tyrells comes when he shows Ned a picture of Marjorie and asks if she looks like Lyanna. It turns out there was a plot afoot to get Robert to set Cersei aside and marry Marjorie. And that plan could really only have originated in the knowledge of Cersei's treason and the illegitimacy of her children. Since we strongly suspect that Stannis was alerted by Littlefinger, it's reasonable to think that Renly was as well. That Renly and Peter were friendly is hinted at by Stannis in Clash when he angrily says, "What has Renly ever done to earn a throne? He sits in council and jests with Littlefinger."
And when Robert lay dying, it was Renly who urged Ned to seize Cersei's children to prevent her acting. When Ned refused and Robert died, Renly fled the city with Loras Tyrell and the armed men he had recently offered Ned. But he wasn't the only one urging an alliance. Shortly after Ned spoke with Renly and confirmed that Robert had named him Protector, Littlefinger came to his chambers. He revealed that he knew Ned had been named Protector, which he could have learned from Renly, although he hinted at Varys being his source, which incidentally is a convenient cover for obtaining secret knowledge that he used in the past with Catelyn. He suggested that the Tyrell's red wines would oppose Stannis and urged Ned to make peace with Cersei, while secretly allying with Renly. When Ned predictably chose Stannis, Littlefinger offered to obtain the support of the Goldcloaks.
And it's made very clear later on by Tyrion, and even later by Stannis, that Janos Slynt was in the employ of Littlefinger. Knowing that, and in light of Slynt's betrayal, in retrospect, it's easy to point the finger of blame for Ned's arrest at Littlefinger. But George has a more nuanced view, and he's acknowledged the roles of everyone from Sansa and Cersei to Ned himself, as well as Littlefinger, Varys, and Slynt.
So while not completely responsible, Littlefinger played a role. In addition to being motivated by his continuing obsession with Catelyn Stark, Littlefinger most likely had a sustained interest in furthering the public friction between the Starks and Lannisters. This kind of opportunism is very typical of Littlefinger and could be one of the key reasons why George thinks of him as one of his most Machiavellian characters. And nothing accomplished his goal of chaos more thoroughly than the death of Lord Stark on the order of Joffrey Baratheon, who, as we mentioned, may well have had one of his counsellors whispering in his ear to undo the careful negotiation of Varys and Cersei.
Yeah, we gain further damning evidence against Littlefinger in Clash of Kings when Tyrion and Varys have a discussion about power. Varys has posed a riddle to Tyrion about the nature of power. As part of the answer, he uses the example of Ned Stark's execution on the steps of Baelor's Sept. He asks the rhetorical question, who truly killed Eddard Stark, do you think? Joffrey, who gave the command? Sir Ilan Payne, who swung the sword? Or another? And the answer, when Tyrion demands it, is this. Power resides where men believe it resides, no more and no less. So power is a mummer's trick? A shadow on the wall, Varys murmured. Yet shadows can kill, and ofttimes a very small man can cast a very large shadow.
Now many fans interpret that last bit as a reference to Tyrion himself, obviously a very small man whose actions will come to have a large impact on the plot. And we agree with this as a metatextual interpretation, but there could also be a double meaning. It's been noted that that statement was made in reply to the rhetorical question, who killed Eddard Stark? And that there is a man who is in a position to influence that chain of events, who has also been noted to be very small, Peter Baelish.
Right. We think what Varys is referencing here is the subtlety of Baelish's involvement in Stark's death, and his apparent hidden influence over Joffrey. And later, from Cersei's point of view in A Dance with Dragons, as she begins her walk of shame, we gain insight into what was supposed to happen that day. It came to her suddenly that she had stood on this very spot before, on the day Lord Eddard Stark had lost his head. That was not supposed to happen. Joff was supposed to spare his life and send him to the wall. Stark's eldest son would have followed him as Lord of Winterfell, but Sansa would have stayed at court, a hostage. Varys and Littlefinger had worked out the terms, and Ned Stark had swallowed his precious honor and confessed his treason to save his daughter's empty little head. I would have made Sansa a good marriage, a Lannister marriage. Not Joff, of course, but Lancel might have suited, or one of his younger brothers. Peter Baelish had offered to wed the girl himself, she recalled. But of course that was impossible. He was much too lowborn. If Joff had only done what he was told, Winterfell would never have gone to war, and father would have dealt with Robert's brothers.
So we want to make a note that the circumstance that Cersei blames for the War of the Five Kings seems to be a result of Baelish's scheming, although she doesn't realise it. Also, note Littlefinger's apparent offer to wed Sansa before Ned was executed. Is it possible Peter had such a course of action in mind when he betrayed Ned with the gold cloaks? He certainly showed odd interest in Sansa from their very first meeting.
So Littlefinger volunteered to marry Sansa, and when that was denied him, he later offered to woo Lysa Arryn to bring her into the fold. Of course, until he was granted Harrenhal in the wake of his service in the Battle of the Blackwater, he wasn't marriage material for Lady Lysa either, but he was clearly angling for a reward of some size, and ultimately, perhaps the daughter of a disgraced Lord Paramount might have been it. And we think he had similar intentions in mind when he volunteered to negotiate with the Tyrells in the wake of Renly's death.
I am of the King's counsel, yet not the King's blood, so would make a poor hostage. I knew Solorus passing well when he was here at court, and gave him no cause to mislike me. Mace Tyrell bears me no enmity that I know of, and I flatter myself that I am not unskilled in negotiation. So, as much as Tyrion didn't trust him, he had to admit Littlefinger was right for the job. But while Tyrion's innate mistrust of Baelish does him credit, on this, as on other occasions, he failed to ask himself the questions that might have yielded insight if he could find the answers. Why was it so important to Peter Baelish that he be sent on a dangerous mission across the breadth of the country when it would seem his best interests were in King's Landing, or at the very least, the Vale? Was there a clue to be had in Baelish's casual offer to bring Paxter Redwine's sons with him and return them to their father?
Yeah, and there could be a hint there that Baelish wanted to curry personal favor with the nobles of the Reach. And we do get more of the story of Littlefinger's Tyrell alliance when he leads Sansa to the answer of who killed Joffrey after her flight from the Purple Wedding. Here's a passage. When I came to Highgarden to dicker for Marjorie's hand, Lady Olenna let her lord's son bluster while she asked pointed questions about Joffrey's nature. I praised him to the skies, to be sure, whilst my men spread disturbing tales amongst Lord Tyrell's servants. That is how the game is played. I also planted the notion of Sir Loras taking the white. Not that I suggested it, that would have been too crude, but men in my party supplied grisly tales about how the mob had killed Sir Preston Greenfield, and raped the Lady Lawless, and slipped a few silvers to Lord Tyrell's army of singers to sing of Ryam Redwine, Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, and Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight. A harp can be as dangerous as a sword in the right hands. Mace Tyrell actually thought it was his own idea to make Sir Loras's inclusion in the Kingsguard part of the marriage contract.
And Littlefinger's story goes on to implicate Lady Olenna not only as the brains behind House Tyrell, but as the chief architect of the Purple Wedding and Joffrey's death to boot. While we think this is a pretty clear example of Baelish telling Sansa only what he wants her to know, we'd like to talk about the origin of the poison that killed Joffrey.
Okay, so in Maester Cressen's Clash of Kings prologue point of view, we learned about the Strangler, a poison in the form of a little purple crystal that, quote, dissolved in wine would make the muscles of a man's throat clench tighter than any fist, shutting off his windpipe. Cressen goes on to think about the method of manufacturing the poison, and that, quote, the alchemists of Lys knew the way of it, and the faceless men of Bravos, and the maesters of his order as well, though it was not something talked about beyond the walls of the citadel. Cressen no longer recalled the name the Ashai gave the leaf or the Lysine poisoners the crystal. In the citadel, it was simply called the Strangler.
So a likely source of the poison that killed Joff is Lys. Considering Peter Baelish's overseas trading network, and the fact his creature, Dontos Hollard, delivered the silver hairnet containing the crystals to Sansa immediately following Baelish's return to the city after the Blackwater, it seems pretty clear that Littlefinger is the best candidate for the origin of the poison, and that he was involved with orchestrating the events that led to Joffrey's death and the rise of House Tyrell.
And such careful and subtle planning gives the lie to his claim to Sansa that his involvement in Joffrey's death had no purpose. Remember that at the council meeting where the issue of a Tyrell alliance was first raised, Littlefinger made reference to a future reward. I trust that on my return the king will see that I am suitably rewarded for my valiant efforts in his cause. And when Cersei pointedly asked him what he wanted, Littlefinger replied, I shall need to give that some consideration. No doubt I'll think of something. His significant look at Tyrion implies that perhaps he's still angling for the promised prize of Harrenhal, but that his ultimate goal may have actually been Sansa comes to us in hindsight, through Sansa's own point of view.
Yes, after Sansa escapes from King's Landing with his aid, and we get the backstory behind his plotting with the Tyrells. But before that, we get little hints, such as when Littlefinger is granted Harrenhal and leave to marry Lysa Arryn at a council meeting following the Battle of the Blackwater, during which Kevin Lannister also relays to Tyrion, only yesterday Littlefinger brought us word of a Tyrell plot to spirit Sansa Stark off to Highgarden for a visit and there marry her to Lord Mace's eldest son, Willis.
So it should be clear at that point that Peter Baelish had something special in mind for Sansa, and that the Tyrells weren't part of it. But his relationship with the Tyrells must have gone back years. Remember he told Ned at his first council meeting that besides Lord Tywin, he'd also borrowed from Lord Tyrell, amongst others. That he was able to counter Lady Olenna's plan to spirit Sansa away with his own plan through the clever use of the spy Dontos Hollard is a hallmark of Baelish's scheming. His plans seem to involve multiple contingencies, which again highlights his facility for making situations work to his own advantage.
And while in betraying the Tyrell's Sansa plot, Baelish upheld the appearance of loyalty to the Lannisters and furthered his own long-term secret goal of seizing Sansa for himself. It will later seem self-evident that Baelish and Tyrell plotted together against House Lannister. But earlier Littlefinger had been careful to downplay his connection to the Tyrells when he first put himself forth for that diplomatic mission, when he declared, "Mace Tyrell bears me no enmity that I know of, and I flatter myself that I am not unskilled in negotiation."
So, another hallmark of Littlefinger's machinations is the power of suggestion. We saw it with the execution of Eddard Stark, and we see it again clearly in the Tyrell plot. And we later learned that it was Baelish's suggestion that Garland Tyrell don Renly Baratheon's armor at the Battle of the Blackwater. When Loras tells Jaime Lord Littlefinger suggested it, he said it would frighten Stannis' ignorant men-at-arms. So, digging deep, we find Baelish's little fingers in many of the significant events that occur in King's Landing from Game of Thrones onwards.
Yeah, and while Littlefinger can't be held directly responsible for Tywin's death and Cersei's downfall, he does tell Sansa in A Feast for Crows. Cersei stumbles from one idiocy to the next, helped along by her counsel of the deaf, the dim, and the blind. I always anticipated that she would beg the realm and destroy herself, but I never expected she would do it quite so fast. It is quite vexing. I had hoped to have 4 or 5 quiet years to plant some seeds and allow some fruits to ripen, but now it is a good thing that I thrive on chaos.
So we think Littlefinger expected Cersei's destruction to come about as a result of things he had set in motion, but didn't anticipate it happening so quickly. As an aside, we also think that's a very sly metatextual wink to the reader about the so-called 5-year gap that George abandoned during the writing of A Feast for Crows. At any rate, Tywin's death and Cersei's fall did have their roots in the Tyrell Rise, the Purple Wedding, and Tyrion's implication in Joffrey's death. So Littlefinger can definitely be said to have been a major player in the destruction of House Lannister.
And speaking of Tyrion, now we come to the final piece of this segment, and that is Littlefinger's successful removal of Tyrion Lannister from the board. When Tyrion returned to King's Landing as acting Hand of the King, following his imprisonment by Lysa Arryn, he quickly set up an adversarial relationship with Baelish. To be fair, it was Tywin who had commanded Tyrion to bring Pycelle, Varys and Littlefinger to heel, all men who, it must be admitted, Tywin had found very useful in one way or another over the years.
And Tyrion develops a tentative alliance with Varys and quickly exposes Pycelle as a spy for his sister. His ruthless treatment of the Grand Maester would bear bitter fruit in the future, but his attempts to expose Littlefinger would bring equally troubling results. Tyrion's offer of Myrcella for Robert Arryn, which Littlefinger was to present to Lysa, was quickly exposed as a sham when the Martells' acceptance of the true offer was announced in council. We want to make note of 2 details from the meeting where Tyrion laid his attempted trap for Littlefinger.
So first is the fact that Littlefinger was wearing, on that occasion and on others, the dragonbone hilt dagger that Catelyn had brought to King's Landing, and was last seen in the quarters of Ned Stark just before his arrest. Baelish's retrieval of the dagger, whether by stealth or by specific request from the king, shows not only his complacency, but a desire to tweak Tyrion's nose with this object that would continue to have an impact on Tyrion's arc. Tyrion's assumptions about Joffrey and the dagger might have been tempered had he stopped to consider the how and why of Baelish having it back in his own possession. Whether Joffrey was responsible for the catspaw or not, we think Tyrion should have taken the possibility that it might have been an agent of Littlefinger employed to sow discord between the Starks and the Lannisters more seriously.
And we also assume that Littlefinger still has that dagger, and we wonder if it will have any further significance to the plot. Now, secondly, and perhaps not unrelated to the dagger, is Tyrion's attempt to sweeten the offer being made to Lysa Arryn. Here's the exchange. If I gave her Jon Arryn's true killer, she might think more kindly of me. That made Littlefinger sit up. True killer? I confess you make me curious. Who do you propose?
We think this is the turning point for Tyrion, because this attempt to winkle some secret knowledge from Peter Baelish may have actually been perceived by Littlefinger as a threat, a kind of I know something about you moment that would ultimately lead to Littlefinger's need to remove Tyrion from play. And the fact that the offer turned out to be a sham, wounding Baelish's pride as it did, only cemented the enmity between the two men. In our next segment, we'll be talking about the various agents and spies of Littlefinger and how they brought him information and advanced his plans. For now, let's make note that it was Peter Baelish who hired the mummers that mocked Tyrion at Joffrey's wedding, and that the obvious friction created by that scene was what led to Cersei's accusation of Tyrion, and ultimately Tyrion's arrest and what should have been his execution.
Yeah, Littlefinger admitted his involvement to Sansa on board the Merlin King and hinted at his motives as well. Here's the passage. Tell me of the feast. The queen took such pains, the singers, the jugglers, the dancing bear. Did your little lord husband enjoy my jousting dwarfs? Yours? I had to send to Braavos for them and hide them away in a brothel until the wedding. The expense was exceeded only by the bother. It is surprisingly difficult to hide a dwarf, and Joffrey, you can lead a king to water, but with Joff one had to splash it about before he realized he could drink it. When I told him about my little surprise, his grace said, Why would I want some ugly dwarfs at my feast? I hate dwarfs. I had to take him by the shoulder and whisper, Not as much as your uncle will. The deck rocked beneath her feet, and Sansa felt as if the world itself had grown unsteady. They think Tyrion poisoned Joffrey. Sir Dantos said they seized him. Littlefinger smiled. Widowhood will become you, Sansa.
So here's another example of Littlefinger using the power of suggestion to bring about a desired outcome. And we learn later in the Tyrion POV that it was a Kettleblack who went to Pentos and hired Penny and Oppo for the wedding. That this was likely Baelish's second attempt to remove Tyrion is something we'll discuss in our next segment. We'll conclude here by summing up that Peter Baelish has shown a remarkable ability to create chaos for a purpose, and that his agility of mind has enabled him to capitalise even in situations that he lacks control of. From the deaths of Jon Arryn and Ned Stark, to the Purple Wedding, and the ultimate decline of House Lannister, Baelish has put plans in motion that ultimately further his own interests. In the process, House Baratheon has been sidelined, as has House Arryn and House Tully.
And in our next episode, we'll consider his plotting involving Sansa Stark and the Vale, as well as his ultimate endgame and where we see things heading in the Winds of Winter. To conclude today's episode, we're going to take a brief look now at some of the mechanics of Baelish's plots as we consider who his agents are and what they might be doing for him even now.
You could turn King's Landing upside down and not find a single man with a mockingbird sewn over his heart, but that does not mean I am friendless.
So far, we've mentioned a number of agents that Peter Baelish has in place that enable him to plan and execute his complex plots. Whether collecting information or performing actual tasks that advance his goals, these agents are amongst Littlefinger's key assets. We're going to take a look at some of the obvious ones and their impact on the plot here, and we'll also put forward a few candidates that we think are less obvious, but no less crucial.
Okay, so let's start by discussing a couple we've already mentioned, including Janos Slynt, who is called Littlefinger's man by Tyrion, and whose arrogance in the aftermath of Ned Stark's death ultimately led to his banishment. In his confrontation with Tyrion, he brags about his relationships with Joffrey, Cersei, and Littlefinger. But in light of his involvement with Stark's execution and the murder of the child Barra, both of which mark him as a man bought and sold by people Tyrion is trying to bring to heel, he's sent to the Wall and the company of Ned's son, Jon Snow. There he continued to use his supposed friends in King's Landing as a shield.
And of course, small good that does him, since, with his usefulness at an end, none of these friends are in a position to help when his arrogance leads him to the block. Next on the list of Littlefinger's agents, whom we've already identified, is Sir Dontos Hollard. A sad man with a tragic past, we learn that the child Dontos was saved from the wrath of Aerys Targaryen in the aftermath of the defiance of Duskendale by the kindness of Sir Barristan Selmy. But Dontos grew into a drunken adult whom Littlefinger called dismissively a skin of wine with legs. After Sansa saved his life by suggesting that Joffrey make him his fool rather than execute him, Dontos appeared to take the lead in setting Sansa up for her part in the Purple Wedding and her subsequent flight.
Yeah, although we later learned that the note with the words, "Come to the Godswood tonight if you want to go home," originated with Baelish, it was Dontos who met her there and appealed to Sansa's love of stories by offering to be her Florian, a reference to Florian the Fool of legend. This angle was no doubt suggested by Littlefinger, who was well aware of Sansa's romantic nature and could have guessed that she would respond to this scenario that brought one of her favourite songs to life. Dontos was also one of the only people who made a move to help her in the scene where Joffrey was having her beaten for her brother's actions, the others being Sandor and of course Tyrion.
Well, in their meetings, Dontos promises to bring Sansa home when his friend returns to the city with a ship for them. And of course, in the aftermath of the Blackwater, with Peter Baelish in the city once more, Dontos tells her the day is set and makes her a gift he tells her is magic, you see. It's justice you hold. It's vengeance for your father.
So the silver hairnet makes its way to Sansa's possession, and she's instructed to wear it to Joffrey's wedding, which is the appointed day for her escape. But later, when she informs Dontos of the Tyrell's intent to spirit her to Highgarden to marry her to Willis, she unknowingly seals her own fate, as the Lannisters marry her to Tyrion to forestall that plan.
And the fact that we learn that it was Peter Baelish that brought the news of the Tyrell plot to the Lannisters should tell us all we need to know about Dontos Hollard. He's an agent of Littlefinger, and the swift reaction to the Tyrell plot illustrates Baelish's great facility for counterplots and contingency plans. As if playing a chess game, he sacrificed Sansa to the Tyrion marriage, keeping the long view that he could dispose of Tyrion and still make away with the girl. It's worth mentioning the fact that he could not have predicted that Tyrion would never consummate the marriage and in fact treat Sansa with kindness. Yet Littlefinger was completely willing to see Sansa suffer through whatever happened in service to his own goals.
Yeah, no surprise really, just something to think about. And the next agent we'll talk about is Lothar Brune, who is mentioned a few times before we learn of his connection to Littlefinger in Clash, where he was to face none other than Dontos Hollard in Joffrey's name day tourney. Here's the herald's call. Lothar Brune, free rider in the service of Lord Baelish, and Sir Dontos the Red of House Hollard.
Yeah, and so we learn that Lothar Brune works for Littlefinger. He had earlier competed in the Tourney of the Hand, and as we mentioned earlier, it's possible that he, or someone like him, was in Littlefinger's service as early as the royal visit to Winterfell. But after he's given knighthood following the Battle of Blackwater, we don't see Brune again, probably because he leaves the city with his patron. The next time he appears is aboard the Merling King after the Purple Wedding, where he takes the lead in the execution of Dontos Hollard. He protects Sansa from Marillion's advances at Littlefinger's keep on the Fingers, and he's named Captain Guard at the Eyrie by the new Lord Protector of the Vale. He's admittedly one of Littlefinger's key agents, but Sansa actually seems to become quite fond of him, and she notes his affection for Maya Stone.
And in light of that, we have to wonder if Sansa will make use of some early advice Baelish gave her. When you know what a man wants, you know who he is and how to move him. Given that the direction their relationship seems to be going is quite friendly, it seems possible Sansa might try and motivate him to help her in some way in the future, although it could go the opposite way. So there's Lothar Brune. And another agent is Oswell Kettleblack, who, in Littlefinger's own words, has a curious relationship with Brune. Kettleblack watches Brune for me, and Brune watches Kettleblack, says Littlefinger.
Both Oswell and Sir Lothar know Sansa's identity, so Littlefinger has set them in opposition to each other to protect his interests. He's very quick to school Sansa to trust no one. Anyway, by the time we learn of Oswell's existence, we've also met his 3 sons, Osmond, Osney, and Osfrid. However, prior to the reveal of Oswell, we've been led to believe that the Kettleblacks were Tyrion's men, as this passage from a Tyrion point of view indicates. Cersei would don a plain brown traveller's cloak and steal off to meet a certain hedge knight with the unlikely name of Sir Osmond Kettleblack and his equally unsavory brothers Osney and Osfrid. Lancel had told him all about them. Cersei meant to use the Kettleblacks to buy her own force of sellswords. Well, let her enjoy her plots. She was much sweeter when she thought she was outwitting him. The Kettleblacks would charm her, take her coin, and promise her anything she asked, and why not, when Bronn was matching every copper penny, coin for coin? Amiable rogues, all 3, the brothers were, in truth, much more skilled at deceit than they'd ever been at bloodletting. Cersei had managed to buy herself 3 hollow drums. They'd make all the fierce booming sounds she required, but there was nothing inside. It amused Tyrion to no end.
Well, obviously Tyrion has also been led to believe that the Kettleblacks were his, but we learn differently from Littlefinger when he tells Sansa, "When the imp sent off her guards, the queen had Sir Lancel hire sellswords for her. Lancel found her the Kettleblacks, which delighted your little lord husband, since the lads were in his pay through his man Bronn." He chuckled. "But it was me who told Oswell to get his sons to King's Landing when I learned that Bronn was looking for swords. 3 hidden daggers, Elaine, now perfectly placed."
And at this point it remains to be seen how perfectly placed those daggers are, since Osney is currently being tortured by the Faith, thanks to Cersei's ill-conceived scheming. But that passage raises an interesting question. Let's look at the statement, "When I learned that Bronn was looking for swords," and consider exactly how Littlefinger came by that knowledge.
Well, we think there are a couple of possibilities. We're going to consider both and let you listeners decide. Bronn appeared in the Riverlands, conveniently in the same location as Catelyn Stark when she encountered Tyrion at the inn at the crossroads. One of, quote, "a pair of unsavoury sellswords who looked as though they'd kill him as soon as spit."
While as events unfolded, Bronn quickly ingratiated himself with Tyrion and is obviously highly motivated by his own self-interest throughout his arc. We wonder at the chance that led him to being in that location. Could he have been sent to inform on Catelyn's movements on her way back to Winterfell? It's certainly very convenient that he was present to offer his sword when Catelyn needed him, and so we wonder if Bronn could be an informer of some sort. In support of him being an informant, let's consider a piece of information Baelish gives Sansa in A Storm of Swords.
Yeah, he tells her Tyrion had been married before. Here's the passage. "He had a wife before you. Did you know that?" "He told me." "And did he tell you that when he grew bored of her, he made a gift of her to his father's guardsman? He might have done the same with you in time."
Now, we could just chalk that up to Littlefinger's apparent omniscience, or we could consider how on earth he came by that very personal bit of information. And as far as we know, in story, Tyrion has shared the story of Tisha with just two people, Bronn and Shae. We think it's likely that one of them could be the source of that information. Of course, Shae could also have been the source of the intelligence that Tyrion had Bronn hiring sellswords, and her appearance in the Riverlands was also very convenient and could bear further explanation.
And given Littlefinger's involvement with whores and brothels, we might give a slight edge to Shae being the informant. And as for the next person on the list of possible agents, we'll forgive you if this character doesn't ring a bell immediately. Sansa had two maids while she was married to Tyrion, Shae and Brella. On several occasions in Feast, Brienne remembers her interview with Brella. One of those memories is quite interesting. In King's Landing, Brienne had found Sansa's former maid doing washing in a brothel. Here's the quote. "I served with Lord Renly before Milady Sansa, and both turned traitor," the woman Brella complained bitterly. "No lord will touch me now, so I have to wash for whores."
Well, it could be coincidence that Brella is now in a brothel, but it's possible that Littlefinger stashed her there. Shae was taken and questioned and forced to testify at Tyrion's trial. Brella was never mentioned, and while Shae served a purpose with her close relationship to Tyrion, and her testimony could be expected to be focused in that direction, if our suspicions are correct, Littlefinger may have wanted Brella away from Cersei's questioning to avoid awkward questions about such things as Sansa's visits to the Godswood, which might suggest plotting and divert attention from Tyrion. Having a maid spying on Sansa and Tyrion would make sense, and it's even possible there was a Brune-Kettleblack dynamic in play, with two spies keeping each other honest, as it were. But we think the fact that she also worked for Renly is very interesting, since we've pointed out that Renly, with his plot to have Robert set Cersei aside in favor of Margaery Tyrell, must have also known about the incest. We wonder if we don't have another of Littlefinger's agents here in Brella.
Yeah, it's an interesting tidbit, easy to miss, and as always, we have to wonder if George drops these things into the narrative for a reason. Okay, now for the next one, we're going to back up a bit. At the Battle of Blackwater, Tyrion is nearly killed by Sir Mandon Moore. It says, "The knight was a white steel shadow, his eyes shining darkly behind his helm. Tyrion had no more strength than a ragdoll. Sir Mandon put the point of his sword to the hollow of his throat and curled both hands around the hilt."
And only the quick action of the devoted Podrick Payne saved Tyrion's life there. In the aftermath, Tyrion decides that, quote, "Cersei must have paid him to see that I never came back from the battle." But his efforts to turn up the truth yield precious little, as this passage from Storm shows. Bronn had turned up all he could on Sir Mandon, but no doubt Varys knew a deal more, should he choose to share it. "The man seems to have been quite friendless," Tyrion said carefully. "Sadly," said Varys, "oh, sadly. You might find some kin if you turned over enough stones back in the Vale, but here Lord Arryn brought him to King's Landing, and Robert gave him his white cloak, but neither loved him much, I fear."
So let's draw attention to the phrase that Mandon Moore is quite friendless, which is echoed by Littlefinger to Sansa later in A Storm of Swords. You could turn King's Landing upside down and not find a single man with a mockingbird sewn over his heart, but that does not mean I am friendless. So there seems to be a connection there. Two apparently friendless boys from the Vale brought to King's Landing by Jon Arryn. And as for a possible motive, let's return to something we discussed in the previous segment, Tyrion's exchange with Littlefinger that, in light of what we learn at the end of A Storm of Swords, may have been interpreted as a threat. If I gave Liza John Arryn's true killer, she might think more kindly of me. That made Littlefinger sit up. True killer? I confess, you make me curious. Who do you propose?
Well, we think there's a case to be made that Littlefinger may have either found it in his interest to plant an agent on the Kingsguard, or found it advantageous to recruit a fellow Valeman to his service when some opportunity arose. And we definitely think he had a motive to try to kill Tyrion. For that reason, we'd add Mandon Moore to a list of possible agents of Littlefinger.
And now, before we discuss the final candidate on our list, we want to mention that our friend Brendan Beefish has written about this subject in part 2 of his essay series called The Agents of Chaos. We earlier referenced his conclusion that Littlefinger was responsible for Stannis' knowledge of Cersei's infidelity. In the same essay, he identifies 2 knights in Stannis' service, Richard Horpe and Justin Massey, as possible unwitting intermediaries, using something we've also discussed, the power of suggestion, to transfer information from Littlefinger and Stannis. It's a good read that sheds some possible light on Baelish's methods, and we recommend checking it out.
Yeah, we do, and I was particularly interested in the possibility of Justin Massey as an unwitting intermediary, since he seems poised to play a role at the Wall, and perhaps even in Braavos in the Winds of Winter. It seems like we'll be seeing a lot more of him. And now for the final suspect, we're going to look at the Vale again, and just quickly mention someone who will come up in our next episode. It's clear Littlefinger has deep connections in Galtown. He says as much to Sansa, and in A Feast for Crows, we learn that he brokered a marriage between a wealthy Galtown merchant's daughter and Lionel Corbray, effectively buying off House Corbray. But it's also made clear in A Feast for Crows that Sir Lyn Corbray is in Littlefinger's direct employ. After a meeting between Baelish and the Lords Declarant, where Sir Lyn's aggressive threats towards Littlefinger in council lead to a wary accord with the other lords, Baelish tells Sansa, "Sir Lyn will remain my implacable enemy. He will speak of me with scorn and loathing to every man he meets, and lend his sword to every secret plot to bring me down." And the passage continues, "That was when her suspicion turned to certainty. And how shall you reward him for this service?" Littlefinger laughed aloud. "With gold and boys and promises, of course. Sir Lyn is a man of simple tastes, my sweetling. All he likes is gold and boys and killing."
Okay, so we'll see more of this connection next time when we discuss the Elaine spoiler chapter from Winds. And speaking of the Elaine chapter, we do see another character there whose motivations are definitely shadowy. Sir Shadrick, aka the Mad Mouse, who was first encountered in Feast by Brienne. At the time, he claimed he was seeking Sansa Stark, so he could claim a plump bag of gold that Varys had offered as a reward for her. Then at the end of Feast, he appears in the Vale with 2 other sellswords having been hired by Littlefinger. He's still there in Winds and has a curious exchange with Elaine when she bumps into him. And to make conversation, asks if he will participate in the tourney or the melee. It says, "A good melee is all a hedge knight can hope for, unless he stumbles on a bag of dragons. And that's not likely, is it?"
So there's a play on words hidden in that statement because he's almost literally just stumbled on Elaine. And we bring this up here because it seems pretty clear the Mad Mouse is a spy of some sort, perhaps working for Varys, perhaps for someone else. And if he's not working for Peter Baelish, then here we have one clear example of someone else getting a piece in place with the potential to cause some problems with Littlefinger's game.
Now let's conclude here by saying that looking into all of these agents, combined with the apparently endless list of men who were appointed by or purchased positions from him in King's Landing, his nameless friends, we find there are a lot of reasons to believe that Peter Baelish's network extends beyond those who are identified in the text as his agents. But like most of the tales surrounding Baelish, we don't find this indicates any kind of omnipotence on his part. On the contrary, it supports the idea that he's a master adapter, always ready with a contingency plan or another spy from his extensive network to achieve his own ends.
Okay, and we'll be wrapping this one up in just a few minutes, but first it's time for a message from today's sponsors, as well as a few words from another A Song of Ice and Fire podcast. From international trading to domestic entertainment, Baelish Enterprises is a diversified corporation with its shareholders' unique interest in mind. Sole shareholder Peter Baelish invites you to take part in one of the many opportunities Baelish Enterprises offers for his own enrichment. Whether it's trading, holding an office, taking a loan, or warehousing goods for future sale, Peter Baelish guarantees your efforts will benefit the shareholder. Unwind at a house of entertainment owned by the corporation and see why diversification really pays off for the serious businessman. Baelish Enterprises, from whores to ships, no matter which one you're boarding, make sure it's Baelish.
Ladies and gentlemen, nerds and neckbeards...
Wait, Dave, I have a question for you. What do Tequila Sunspears, Stannis Sours, Valar Mojitos, and River Rum Punch all have in common?
I'm stumped.
They're drinks that pair extremely well with our Song of Ice and Fire podcast.
I should have known that.
Listen, if you're looking for interesting,
inebriated,
often rambling discussions of A Song of Ice and Fire, then Westeros Wheneverly is a podcast for you.
So mix up your drinks and head on over to worry.podbean.com for the latest episodes or search Westeros Wheneverly on iTunes.
All men
must drink.
So, Tana and Dave from Westeros Wheneverly podcast there. They have fun talking A Song of Ice and Fire over Westeros-themed cocktails, which is a pretty good combination in our opinion. So head on over to Westeros Wheneverly to check them out. We're going to wrap up today's episode with a few takeaways that we hope will carry into part 2, where we'll look back in time at Littlefinger's youth and explore his actions in the Vale, and we'll provide our own ideas for his fate.
Yeah, we'll also be looking at his endgame, and we hope to provide greater focus for a lot of the plotting and manipulation we've laid out today. It comes as no surprise that Peter Baelish, the master adapter, is always ready with a contingency plan for his contingency plans. He utilizes every asset available to him and employs spies to keep his plots informed. His creative finance has made him nearly untouchable in the sense that his expertise is required to not only keep the financial engine running, but to untangle the complex web of loans, kickbacks, and indebtedness that he's constructed.
And that's something that might have interesting implications for the Lannisters and King's Landing going forward. Another characteristic we find intriguing is his use of suggestion and the subtlety with which he's able to bend others to his will. We'll definitely see more of this in the next episode, and while the Purple Wedding may have been the textbook example of keep your foes confused, we don't think he's quite done with that tactic either.
So that's it for this one. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you've enjoyed this first part of our discussion of one of the most complex characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. Be sure to come back next time for part 2 and our conclusions. And now it's time to give credit where credit is due. As always, to George R.R. Martin, thank you for your marvelous characters and their stories. And to Kevin MacLeod, many thanks for allowing us to use elements of your music in our production. Thanks also to all our listeners. We couldn't do it without you. Visit RadioWesteros.com for quick access to all our podcasts. You can also donate and comment on our content there, or connect with us via Twitter, Facebook, Google+, or Tumblr. Thanks again for being with us today. We'll see you next time for part 2.